Okay. Well, first of all, thank you so much for organizing this conference and for your efforts to address difficult logistics thanks to the pandemic, and also for your efforts to accommodate those of us who are not Francophones. It would, of course, be preferable for all of us to be in person, but Zoom is quite a wonderful alternative. As I begin the paper, I want to offer a few caveats. First, this is a relatively new project for me. It is a product of a tangent of my earlier work on Khalid al-Qasri, and is a tangent that I've picked up again, in part being inspired by this conference to do so. As a consequence, I haven't looked at every source out there that talks about Hajjaj. Pretty much any source that talks about Umayyad Iraq, of course, talks about him, so I haven't managed to slog through all of it at this point. And some of the comparisons remain a bit cursory because this is still at a sort of beginning level. I should also add that thanks to our situation here, some texts have not been accessible to me because of library closures and such things. And so I ask your sort of patience with those shortcomings of the paper. I will not read the paper as it's written, as I've shared it with, I believe, most of you, but instead will offer a sort of summary and elaborate on some of the more important points as we go. Hajjaj ibn Yūsuf is, of course, one of the problematic figures of Umayyad history. He is a critical figure for understanding the Umayyad success in the east, the expansion much farther east than before he came to rule in Iraq. And as we know, he was also a central figure in Abdul Malik's many reforms, whether these are reforms in coinage, in administration, or in religious matters, which we will deal with to some extent today. Hajjaj is, of course, problematic for us because the chronicles emphasize his cruelty and brutality towards Kufans and others. I suspect that many of us were first introduced to Al-Ḥajjāj in our graduate school days by reading his famous khutbah in which he threatens to kill all of the Kufans if they didn't promptly march to war. We find in later sources, even those that are more friendly to Al-Ḥajjāj, actual debates about whether or not he is a kafir or whether he is spending eternity in hell. This is something profound for us to think about, because of course Al-Ḥajjāj also, as we know or are coming to know, plays some sort of significant role in preserving and or codifying the Quran. One of the major figures in codifying the Quran is someone about whose fate in hell is actually being debated in the sources. So this makes him a rather curious kind of character. And the question I have is, how do you deal with someone like this? Someone who is religiously crucial, but also problematic in these ways. And what I found is there are a couple of options that were available. The Iraqi option, which we find in Tabari and all of the other chronicles, is essentially to portray Al-Ḥajjāj as an Umayyad villain, to emphasize the brutality, to focus on the military expansion, and of course to focus also on his treatment of the Kufans along the way, and largely to ignore his role in preserving the Quran. The other option, which I'm going to explore today, is what I would call the Syrian option, which is curious because we find in Syrian historical sources that Al-Ḥajjāj is actually embraced as a Syrian and as an Umayyad, even though, as we'll see, he's not technically a Syrian. These sources tend to downplay the brutality of his reign in Iraq and emphasize his religious merits and his role in preserving and codifying the Quran. Now, the elements of brutality are still there in some of these sources, but they are downplayed and contextualized in different ways that make Al-Ḥajjāj seem, frankly, a little bit less of a tyrant along the way. And so it's this exploration of this reinterpretation of Al-Ḥajjāj in Syrian historiography that I want to look at today. Now, defining Syrian historiography is, of course, a bit problematic because we don't have a Syrian chronicle that survives. We have mostly later Syrian sources, and most of these are in what I would call the biographical tradition, biographies of individuals in discrete sort of form in collections such as Ibn Asakir and others. And these, of course, have different dynamics and themes to them, which we'll discuss in a bit. The earliest source we have from Syria, about Syria, at least in Arabic, is Abu Zur'a's Tariq, which in regard to Al-Ḥajjāj doesn't really tell us much. Al-Ḥajjāj appears here as his birth and death are noted. The fact that he was sent to fight Ibn al-Zubair is noted. He appears in passing in a couple of places, talking about other people. In one instance, so-and-so survived until the days of Al-Ḥajjāj, these kinds of things, without any real reference to him as a person or any evaluation of him as an historical figure. To some extent, this is not entirely surprising. Abu Zur'a's Tariq is, of course, largely focused on hadith transmitters and things like this. We don't find other Umayyad governors here either. And so Abu Zur'a is not a good starting point for us in trying to uncover a sort of Syrian image of Al-Ḥajjāj. The starting point is actually much later with Ibn Asakir. And as many of you know, I have a certain fondness for Ibn Asakir. This is a work that is relatively late in the development of the historical tradition, but it is a pivotal work for us because it focuses on reviving a positive Syrian historical memory, and in many ways pushes back against that predominant narrative of later Abbasid Iraqi sorts of historiography. And perhaps most important for us, I've found that later works by Syrian authors or by people who are trained in Damascus by Syrian scholars and then go elsewhere, tend to copy and emulate Ibn Asakir in really pretty obvious ways. And so for a Syrian history of an Umayyad figure like Al-Ḥajjāj, Ibn Asakir is crucial for us. And today we'll look at Ibn Asakir. We'll also look at some of these later sources, and I'll just sort of give you the basic list here. We have Ibn al-Adim's Bughiyat al-Talab, we have Mizzi's Taqdib al-Kamal, the two works by Zahabi, the Tariq and Siyar, which are radically different in this topic, and al-Safadi, and finally Ibn Kathir. And of course, all of these are relatively late in terms of thinking about early Islamic historiography, but they are part of a construction of a Syrian version of events that again is built within this biographical sort of genre and context. Now, Ibn Asakir's treatment here is, of course, crucial. So we'll spend a fair amount of time talking about how he handles Al-Ḥajjāj. And one of the most curious things about Ibn Asakir is his emphasis on Al-Ḥajjāj as a Syrian. Al-Ḥajjāj, of course, was not born in Syria. He's a native of Taif. He served as a governor of the Hijaz for a while. Then he spent about 20 years as governor of Iraq, first in Kufa and then in Wasit, which of course he built. Whatever time he would have had to spend in Syria is very limited. And so for Ibn Asakir to claim him as a Syrian is a bit curious because he didn't have to do so. It's not as though this is, a well-established Damascene whom you can't ignore. This is someone he decided to include as a Syrian. And the way that he does this is through a couple of strategies. First, he notes that Al-Ḥajjāj had visited Abdul Malik in Damascus. As we'll see, this is a fairly standard technique Ibn Asakir uses to attach people who are not natives to the city. If he wants to include someone in his tariq, who had barely ever been to Damascus, he'll comment about some visit he made, and this will, of course, justify a lengthy entry on that individual. But he also uses another technique to include Al-Ḥajjāj, in that he mentions that Al-Ḥajjāj owned a number of houses in Damascus. And he even notes the specific location of one, which was somewhere near the Qasr of Ibn Abi al-Hadid. Now, this level of specificity is a bit unusual, and it represents a sort of greater effort to attach Al-Ḥajjāj to Syria and to Damascus. Incidentally, I don't know if contemporary readers of Ibn Asakir would have attached some significance to the Qasr of Ibn Abi al-Hadid or not. But in any case, this is a clear effort on Ibn Asakir's part to include Al-Ḥajjāj rather than to exclude him. And this, of course, gives way to nearly 90 pages of text on Al-Ḥajjāj in Ibn Asakir. Now, in this context, when we read through this 90-page entry, or 89 to be more precise, we don't get much discussion of his activities in Iraq. There's a little bit of discussion of Ibn al-Ash'ath's revolt, but very, very little. We get more details about fights against the Khawarij and against Ibn al-Zubayr. We get much more here. And this is curious because, of course, the Khawarij are someone whom later readers of any ilk can agree are bad guys. And Ibn al-Zubayr, of course, from a Syrian perspective, is also someone who is easily identified as an enemy. Ibn Ash'ath's status is a bit blurrier. And so what Ibn Asakir appears to do is to minimize and even ignore Ibn Ash'ath as much as possible. We see the brutality. We see accounts of executions in Ibn Asakir. Sometimes these are coupled with other reports in which Al-Ḥajjāj shows mercy to someone, execution story, and then a forgiveness story next to it to sort of minimize the impact of this brutality. We also get a lot of khutbahs and also explanations of the meanings of these khutbahs. And yes, the famous heads ripe for plucking khutbah when he arrives in Kufa is there, but it appears in a collection of other sermons with various themes and even sort of exegesis explaining what these sermons actually mean attached to them. The themes of the sermons are very consistent. We have a focus on predestination and also an emphasis on obedience to the caliph, and by extension, obedience to Al-Ḥajjāj. One sermon which is repeated a number of times and appears in all of the later sources that I'll discuss as well, has Al-Ḥajjāj explaining that the caliph has absolute authority, that he has deputized Al-Ḥajjāj, and that obedience to Al-Ḥajjāj is then obligatory, to the point where if Al-Ḥajjāj were to order the congregation to use a particular door of the mosque to leave, and they used another door, he would have the right to kill them and take their property. And different sort of other examples are added to this at various points as well. At one point, for instance, we have him proclaiming that if he chose to do so, he could separate Rabi and Mudar, the two tribes, from each other and declare them to be something else. So you see the level of authority that he is asserting here, again, in absolute obedience to the caliph and seeing himself as the embodiment of the caliph's will, at least in Kufa and Iraq. And at the end of Ibn Asakir's entry, we also get this debate about whether or not he is a kafir, an apostate, if he is spending his eternity in hell, if he has been punished in the grave and then admitted to heaven. And we have all sorts of anecdotes about these things included. Some have dreams, later scholars having dreams in which they see Al-Ḥajjāj, who tells them about what happened to him after he died, all of these kinds of things. To some extent, Al-Ḥajjāj provides a sort of site on which later theological questions can play out, an example to use to ask, the Morja question about, the afterlife and salvation, or Mu'tazila kinds of things, punishment in the grave, all of these things. You see, if you sort through it, you can kind of see that people are using Al-Ḥajjāj as an example. Well, what about Al-Ḥajjāj? Kind of approach to these questions. But it is curious, and of course it brings us back to this central point here, that we have this question about whether Al-Ḥajjāj actually is in heaven or hell. And this, of course, becomes important when we think about his role in codifying the Quran. Now, moving forward, in reference to the Quran, Ibn Asakir has a number of indirect references associating Al-Ḥajjāj with the Quran. Some of these praise his intelligence and eloquence. Others note his obsession with proper grammar and things like this. We have more direct references, assorted scholars, including some who didn't like him particularly well, praising his Quran recitations, sort of throwaway references about his love of the Quran, and so on and so forth. A few accounts of his teaching others the Quran, and embedded in lots of stories, we have references to the Quran. For instance, one of the stories in which he frees someone whom he was going to execute, the person is freed after he eloquently recited from the Quran. And so we have these sort of indirect references here. We also have, curiously, references directly to the project of preserving the Quran. We know, of course, that Al-Ḥajjāj was somehow involved in efforts to either codify or preserve the Quran. I'll use the general term preserve here to avoid being too specific. And we do have acknowledgement of this in Ibn Asakir, and in some cases this is explicitly talked about, but usually what Al-Ḥajjāj did to the Quran is not really clearly told to us. We get hints here and there, we get suggestions that he's focusing on adding vowels or correcting grammar or placing divisions in the text, but mostly these are rather vague references to something Al-Ḥajjāj did in relation to preserving or codifying the Quran. Where we get more specific, though, is about Ibn Mas'ud. It is clear in Ibn Asakir that Al-Ḥajjāj despises Ibn Mas'ud's recension of the Quran and is determined to stomp it out. Ibn Mas'ud, of course, was sent to Kufa to teach the Quran, I believe by Omar, and then, as we'll see, has a falling out with Uthman. But the focus here in Ibn Asakir is on Ibn Mas'ud. And one of those versions of the sermon in which he says you can choose which door you use from the mosque, we also have him saying that as the caliph's representative, he can impose the proper reading of the Quran, and that those who continue to recite Ibn Mas'ud's version will be punished, and he can even have them killed for doing so. In another instance, he labels Ibn Mas'ud as the leader of the Munafiqun. So Ibn Mas'ud here is clearly the focus of Al-Ḥajjāj's efforts related to the Quran, at least in the version we have from Ibn Asakir. So out of curiosity, I thought to look to see what Ibn Asakir says about Ibn Mas'ud. And this is an interesting endeavor. Ibn Asakir has a long biography of Ibn Masud, about 144 pages of it. And here is an example of someone whose connection to Damascus is exceptionally weak. The only mention of Damascus I've found in this long biography is a reference to someone seeing him there once, apparently on a visit. But again, this is typical of efforts to claim non-Damascenes to include, and of course, when we're talking about companions of the Prophet, those efforts can be a bit, strained, but you want to include them in your history of Damascus. Most of the biography is about Ibn Masud's interactions with the Prophet. We get descriptions of his knowledge of the Quran, the Prophet's praise of his recitations, the fact that he is the first to recite publicly in Mecca before the Hijrah, a risky endeavor, repeated references to his recitation of 70 surahs. Not clear what surahs we're talking about or if that is code for some particular sort of recension or division of the Quran. Someone else perhaps can help me sort through that. But we also get a discussion of the rupture with Uthman. And here is where Ibn Masud really matters for understanding what is going on with Al-Ḥajjāj. Ibn Asakir specifically links the rupture between Ibn Masud and Uthman to the Quran preservation project. Other sources vaguely talk about a rupture between them, but don't really connect the dots. Here we have specific references. Ibn Masud objects to this project entirely. He claims he has a perfectly good text, so why bother to go through this committee process of creating another one? He claims that he is the most knowledgeable about the Quran and people should simply accept his text. Incidentally, he specifically protests Zayd ibn Thabit's involvement, accuses him of unspecified errors in recitation, also curses him as a Jew and or a Sabaean. And so we have a clear context here for the split with Uthman that focuses entirely on this Quran project. The end of the story, Uthman cuts off Ibn Masud's stipend. Incidentally, interestingly, Al-Zubair then reportedly starts to provide Ibn Masud with funds. Right after telling us that Al-Zubair provides funds, Ibn Asakir throws in a report of Ali praising Ibn Masud and ends the whole entry with a debate about whether it is Uthman or Al-Zubair who prayed at Ibn Masud's funeral. And so we have a rupture here, and I find it curious that Ali and Zubair are thrown into the mix on the side of Ibn Masud. So the rupture here is significant because it tarnishes Ibn Masud. The rift is a product of Ibn Masud's arrogance. I know the Quran better than anyone else, but also Ibn Masud's defiance of caliphal authority in terms of codifying the Quran. And of course, we have this tie then to Ali and Zubair. And this is where we find a connection then between Al-Ḥajjāj and Uthman. Ibn Masud's reading here is in defiance of caliphal authority. And we should remember, of course, that this is something that Al-Ḥajjāj emphasizes, the absolute obedience to the caliph. And this places Al-Ḥajjāj in a position of defending Uthman's codex of the Quran from the corruption of Ibn Masud, who is someone who has defied the caliph in this regard. We find other links between Al-Ḥajjāj and Uthman as well. For instance, at the very beginning of the biography of Al-Ḥajjāj, Ibn Asakir includes a sermon in which Al-Ḥajjāj laments about death and the tomb and all of these things. and his audience comes to tears. This is immediately followed by a report, curiously transmitted on the authority of Abd al-Malik and Marwan, in which Uthman brought an audience to tears, saying essentially the same thing. So there are efforts here to link Al-Ḥajjāj and Uthman, and I don't think that those are accidental efforts. In Ibn Asakir, we have Ḥajjāj being portrayed as the defender of the Uthmanic Codex against a companion who has, in essence, corrupted it. So how is this treated later in Syrian historiography? And I'll go through this part relatively quickly. Essentially, Ibn al-Adim relies very heavily on Ibn Asakir. Most of his entries sort of follow the same order, provide the same anecdotes, so on and so forth. And so here we find nothing surprising, essentially a repetition of Ibn Asakir's discussion of Al-Ḥajjāj. Omeyyade is a different story because he typically follows Ibn Asakir and usually does so without attribution, which is something someone should probably investigate at some point, potential dissertation for someone there. He omits Al-Ḥajjāj entirely. This is a bit surprising, although Omeyyade has omitted other political figures along the way. He does include, for instance, Khalid al-Qasri, who is arguably a less important religious figure than Al-Ḥajjāj does, but he simply leaves him out. And so his method of dealing with Al-Ḥajjāj is to ignore it, which is a perfectly viable option. Al-Zahabi is still more confusing. His Tariq essentially follows Ibn Asakir. I mean, same stories in the same order. He leaves out isnads and repetitions, so it condenses it down to a shorter entry. And then he throws in an aside at the end. Then he has a collection of other stories about Al-Ḥajjāj that he can't verify, so he won't include it. But we get generally the same sort of positive image of Al-Ḥajjāj and his Quran project in the Tariq. In the Siyar, we get something entirely different. The entry is a one-page long, less than a page actually, acknowledges Al-Ḥajjāj's eloquence, and then goes on to describe Al-Ḥajjāj as a tyrant, an oppressor, a fraud, a shedder of blood. He criticizes his attack on the Kaaba, his humiliation of the Hijazis, and he rounds it all out by saying that Al-Ḥajjāj's merits are submerged in the sea of his faults. Hardly a positive evaluation. Oddly, at the very end, he tells us that he has included descriptions of Al-Ḥajjāj's many evil deeds in this Tariq, which he didn't do. So there's something strange between these two entries, and this contradictory agenda is something I can't quite explain, but merits a bit more investigation. If we move on to Safadi, in the interest of time, he follows the Tariq, not the Siyar. We get a slightly different emphasis here, a little bit more about Al-Ḥajjāj's repentance during his final illness. We also have him explicitly mentioning his loyalty to the Banu Marwan and an explicit mention of the Khalifatullah doctrine, which I have not found in these other sources. He also ties Al-Ḥajjāj to Syria in a different manner. We get no mention of houses in Damascus. We have him called the Sayyid Ahl al-Sham instead. And we have an anecdote in which he expresses his preference for Syrian food over Iraqi food. In fact, he beats his cook for bringing him Iraqi food. So we have a culinary attachment to Syria here, rather than a real estate attachment to Syria. And we also get more detail about the Quran project. He specifies that Al-Ḥajjāj has added vowels and spaces to the text. We didn't see this specific reference in earlier sources, suggesting that Safadi is drawing on other non-Syrian biographical sources as well. Finally, Ibn Kathir again follows Ibn Asakir, actually explicitly citing him. And he includes more details about the military campaigns in the East. And he focuses on the Quran project in a slightly different way. He emphasizes the enmity that Al-Ḥajjāj felt for Ibn Mas'ud. He also then inserts a number of sources of reports praising Ibn Mas'ud, which appear to be taken from Ibn Asakir's entry on Ibn Mas'ud. Then he adds reports that accuse Al-Ḥajjāj of lying about Ibn Mas'ud, followed by an explanation that these reports were simply because of Al-Ḥajjāj's connection to the Umayyads. He was an Uthmani Umawi, and this is the reason for these accusations. And in discussing whether or not he is in heaven or hell, we get a slightly different twist, relying on legal scholars, Shafi, Ibn Hanbal, and others, rather than on sort of more historical sources. So there's a slightly different emphasis here, which he seems to start with Ibn Asakir and then move through adding material from other sources, although managing to produce a shorter entry in the process. So where does this take us? Syrian memories of Al-Ḥajjāj are clearly in contrast to Iraqi Abbasid versions. Part of this may be due to the absence of chronicles. Biographical sources don't always lend themselves to neat details of all of the battles that were commanded by various people. But we do have more of a focus on religion and character and discussion of the Quran project that Al-Ḥajjāj is involved in. This may, to an extent, be a product of the genre. Biographies tell the story of a person, not the story of larger events, and you can encompass contradictions in biographies. Someone can be a hero in his own biography and a villain in someone else's biography. But we do see a more negative image in non-Syrian biographical sources. And here I'll point very quickly to Ibn Hajar, who emphasizes those who label Al-Ḥajjāj as a kafir. In fact, he gives a list of the people who said he was an apostate. Focuses on the opposition of the Qur'an to Al-Ḥajjāj, something not mentioned in these earlier Syrian works. And this is especially curious because, of course, Ibn Hajar, Takhdhib is supposed to be a condensation of Al-Mizzi, who didn't include Al-Ḥajjāj. And so Ibn Hajar is going somewhere else for this material. And as a non-Syrian, summarizing a Syrian source, this is something that's interesting and merits more attention. In any case, Ibn Asakir is, of course, central. All of the later sources rely on him. And none of these later Syrian sources try to deny that Al-Ḥajjāj is a Syrian, even though he's from Taif. Mizzi perhaps as a denial by exclusion. And again, Othman and the Quran project are central to all of this. Now, I want to end with a few words about Othman, because Othman is, of course, crucial here. And here we start to understand why Al-Ḥajjāj's inclusion and why Al-Ḥajjāj's project mattered to Syrian historiography so much. Othman is, of course, a progenitor of the Umayyad dynasty in Syrian historical memory. He is responsible for the codification of the Quran as we have it. And this combination makes the Quran an Umayyad accomplishment. And consequently, as presented by Ibn Asakir and others, attempts to alter the Uthmanic Quran become a kind of rebellion against caliphal authority and a rebellion against Umayyad authority. And in this context, Al-Ḥajjāj becomes the protector of the Umayyan Syrian Quran. And so this effort to stamp out Ibn Mas'ud's version of the Quran or reading of the Quran, which of course was embraced by Ali and Zubair and all of these others, becomes an effort to defend Syria and to defend the Umayyad accomplishment. And this is in large part a sort of curious thing to think about in a broader sense, because we're left with a picture in which the Quran as we have it is the product of efforts by Uthman and Al-Ḥajjāj. Arguably, these two, more than anyone except the Prophet himself in the tradition, are responsible for the Quran as we have it. And they are both portrayed in historical sources as deeply flawed individuals. With Uthman, we get these 6 good years, 6 bad years kind of explanation for his reign. I guess people hope that he codified the Quran during the good years rather than the bad years. And of course, Al-Ḥajjāj is the villain in Iraqi historiography. And so we have this sort of strange situation where the two pillars of collecting and preserving the Quran are actually also portrayed as highly corrupt, highly flawed individuals. That, there's debate about whether or not Al-Ḥajjāj is in hell. The implications that has for the text of the Quran and for the way it is discussed and remembered are something that I think need to be explored much further. But in any case, what we see here is an effort by Syrian historiography to rehabilitate Al-Ḥajjāj, at least to some extent. You can't entirely ignore the brutality, but to rehabilitate him to some extent and portray him as a Syrian and as a defender of the Quran as an Umayyad project. So with that, I will stop and get out of this PowerPoint somehow. Okay, there we go.
Thank you very much, Professor. So now we have the floor is for Antoine BORRUT. Antoine, tu nous entends?
Oui, c'est bon.
Voilà. So can we hear? La parole est à toi.
Merci bien. Well, thank you, Steve. Don't worry, I'm not planning on plucking any heads today. So thank you for your paper and for this rich discussion of these competing memories of Al-Ḥajjāj. I mean, there is much to be said, but I'll try to limit myself to a few salient points. I think you're making a very clear case. You've done it before together with others, that basically the Tarikh Madinat Dimashq should be retitled Make Syria Great Again. That will be timely. And so those kind of strategies to Syrianize various protagonists of early Islam are quite fascinating to look at. I was especially interested by your point, both in your oral presentation and in the longer version of the paper, about this tension between Ibn Mas'ud and Al-Ḥajjāj. Basically, Ibn Mas'ud is guilty of not having enough connection with Syria above anything else. He is Syrian-less, and that's a problem here. So I think that's a very rich topic for further inquiry. And at the same time, it also raises interesting questions. So before I go into the question, the first thing I should mention is, since you said this was a preliminary work, certainly you want to look at Pamela Klasova's dissertation on oratory in early Islam and with an enormous focus on Al-Ḥajjāj. It's entitled Empire Through Language. And chapter 3, if memory serves, is entirely devoted to Al-Ḥajjāj in the Tarikh Madinat Dimashq. So she has studied those same questions at length, and I understand she has a forthcoming article about this as well. From quite a different angle. I mean, I can elaborate if you want, as far as I can remember, I was in the committee, but I haven't had a chance to reread the chapter entirely. But she has a lot about another side of the problem of dealing with Al-Ḥajjāj, which is the many accusation of bid'ah, especially things that might look to us maybe not as important as a question of the Quran, like postponing the time of prayers. So in other words, messing with rituals, maybe more than messing around with scripture. So that will be something interesting to think about. But that being said, the two main questions I have for you are connected to two main themes. One has to do with sources, and one has to do with Al-Ḥajjāj's own image. Sources. I was partly surprised in light of your previous work that you, I'm thinking about your chapter in this volume, actually, in the Lindsay volume on Ibn Asakir for an early Islamic history, where you had a chapter on the sources of Ibn Asakir, and they are surprisingly absent from your discussion at this stage. In other words, you are telling us a story of Ibn Asakir as a kind of a, I wouldn't say pioneer, I guess, but as an early example or extant example of Syrian historiography. And yes, I'm with you on the kind of goal to put Syria back on the map and to redeem those Syrian memories, but I would like to hear more about those much earlier layers that, you're right, do not survive as standalone books, but that inform Ibn Asakir's masterpiece. And the question here becomes, perhaps require too much of a discussion for this conference, but here can we detect not just competing narratives, but also competing versions, competing tellings in the sources used by Ibn Asakir. And he preserves a lot of fascinating material that has not survived otherwise. So this is not coming out of thin air. This is something that is based upon memories, Syrian memories, that have been cultivated across generations, and that Ibn Asakir is reworking according to his own agenda. One related question: if we frame this, as you did, entirely as Syria versus Iraq, aren't we falling back into the trap of school theories, of Wellhausen's vision? And aren't we overplaying this? In other words, what about, and Al-Ḥajjāj himself is a great example. He operates at a different scale. Is active as an agent of the Umayyad Empire, not restricted to any province. So aren't we oversimplifying this kind of competing narratives between two potentially antagonists, but still two provinces? On the other hand, we have the question of Al-Ḥajjāj's image. You are making a strong case for the redemption of Al-Ḥajjāj in the Tarikh Medina Dimashq through the use of his role in the collection, composition, redaction of the Quran. So that becomes a central strategy here. And I think that's extremely interesting to think about for the reasons you discussed. There's no point for me to go back to this. But on the other hand, on top of the question, the other kind of contentious problem in that biography in the Tarikh, Medina Dimashq, I'm thinking again with Pamela Klasova about this accusation of bid'ah. We also have a sense that the image of the villain is likewise a construction. Here I think of, I think the first name is Muhammad al-Yamani's dissertation, who has argued that al-Baladhuri was the first one to construct fully the image of the tyrant, an image that is then being cultivated by Mas'udi in particular and others. But so the bottom line becomes, aren't we overplaying this contrast by assuming that the tyrant is the default interpretation here, is the kind of standard narrative, and that everything else has to be contrasted against that? Because this image of the tyrant, of the villain, also has a history and also is a construct. So those are two, set of questions that I'm just bringing up to get us started in the conversation of your paper. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you for those important questions. Regarding the sort of first collection of questions around sources. You are correct that I do need to dig into the sources of Ibn Asakir in describing this. And one of the things that will require is trying to sort out which of those sources are Syrian sources versus non-Syrian sources along the way. And as you know, that's a long process. What my focus here has been on is, regardless of where those sources came from, because some of them are, well known and used in, Iraqi historiography as well. It's a matter of how you put them together and how you construct the narrative. And the narrative that Ibn Asakir is constructing here is very distinct. He has, rearranged his building blocks in a way to create this image of Al-Ḥajjāj, and then that is carried on later. I haven't, reconstructed the bits and pieces of Ibn Asakir sources well enough to elaborate on whether he is simply repeating a narrative that is already in there.
And that's very convincing. But my point is, thinking, for instance, about Cameron's piece in this book about Saif Ibn Umar, used differently by Tabari and Ibn Asakir, then you could make the case potentially that part of the outcome is not only built on Syrian memories, but maybe using Iraqi sources or other sources that are tweaked differently. And so that's where this tension becomes also interesting to think about.
Right, and this is something that needs to be a next step. One thing that strikes me is that we do have here in Ibn Asakir and in the later sources, you talk about this sort of dichotomy between Syrian and Iraqi sources, or Syrian and Iraqi narratives. We do have references here to Iraqis and Syrians as separate, distinct bodies in these discussions. And so those aren't sort of categories that we are imposing. At least by the time of Ibn Asakir, those categories are there. And he is operating within that world. As for Hajjaj's image itself, this is, of course, obviously a redemptive narrative, as you called it. And the image of him as a villain is as you suggest, likely a construct of later historiography. The sort of centrality of Kufans in early Abbasid times perhaps is impetus for constructing the Umayyad rulers over Kufa as being particularly villainous. But I would point to the fact that this image of Al-Ḥajjāj as a sort of villain character is so pervasive by the time we get to Ibn Asakir that it is the dominant narrative. And that image, whatever revisions of that image are being made, can't entirely ignore that dominant narrative. And I think that to some extent explains why, the brutal things he does, the executions, the lists of the numbers of people he has imprisoned, all of these sorts of things are still there in Ibn Asakir and these later sources. You can't ignore that. You can sort of recontextualize it or juxtapose a story of him as a villain with him as a story, with him as someone who is showing mercy, which we often see. But you can't ignore the dominant narrative entirely. And so whether there is another narrative buried in those Syrian sources we're talking about that I haven't quite dug through the isnads to sort out yet is an interesting question. But when we get to Ibn Asakir's time, there is a dominant narrative there. And one of the things I always find curious about Ibn Asakir is we know that he has Tabari's Tariq. He cites it in some cases, but he often utterly ignores it, which points to an agenda of trying his best to move away from that. So I hope that answers your question.
No, you're right. He's doing what Fred Donner asked us to do. He's de-Tabarizing Islamic history. So yeah.
Yeah. See, it's only several hundred years ahead of us. So.
Thank you very much.
Je laisse Mathilde ou Anne-Sylvie prendre le relais pour guider la discussion.
Oui, thank you very much. So, are there any further questions or comments from the room or from the Zoom session? Silence. Oh, yes. Simon Pierre, please.
Yes, hello again. It was just very few elements. If anyone has another
Yes, please.
question to ask,
Yes, please
no
ask
problem.
your question. Yes.
It's just I was thinking about the. Sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. It's just about this issue of the Syrianization or Iraqization, this geographical construction process, building process. And what is very interesting is that we have a clue in the Syriac sources from this time from one person who was living on the border near Sinjar, near Nisribin, who was called Barpenkaye, and he was living in the 680s, and he's really the first to point out this case of Syria against Iraq and to say that Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad was an Iraqi. In every point we can see it, he's an Iraqi, but he's coming back from Syria with Syrian troops, and his Barpenkaye called him a Westerner. So it's a Syrian. So that's very interesting because Barpenkaye is also, for this Quranic issue, the first to refer to Muhammad as the ruler and the Mahadiono, the guide, religious guide, and to speak about his mashlamonut, the traditions, and his laws, namuse, that were enforced in this time. So it's very interesting to see this moment for the territorialization of the issues and also a clue on the Quran. But I don't know if we can link both.
Thank you for that reference. I appreciate that.
With perhaps one caveat, that is that, I mean, I've written a bit about this, and you're right, but I think Syriac sources and early Abbasid era sources are also constructing this a bit differently. So yes, the Euphrates becomes a mirror, but being a Westerner or being an Easterner doesn't exactly necessarily equate to being a Syrian or an Iraqi. It says something about, you know, if you look at early discussion of battles like Siffin in Syriac sources, it's incredibly confused, and I don't have the example now on the top of my head, but those categories are flipped on occasions. So yes, there's something going on. I agree entirely. It's not. I think, Steve, you were right to say, you know, the image is still quite different by the time Ibn al-Sakir is dealing with that. Anyways, that's too long a discussion for now.